Hey everybody, welcome to the Story Collider. Yeah, that's what we like to hear. So by a round of applause, who is at a Story Collider show for the very first time tonight?
All right.
All right, so most of you, it sounds like. So we should probably explain what exactly you're in for. What we do at Story Collider through our shows like this and our podcast is we share true personal stories about science. And what are they not going to hear tonight, Kelly?
These are not lectures. They're not educational. In fact, we always say no learning at Story Collider.
That's right. The first rule of Story Collider is there is no learning at the Story Collider. Tonight, we're just going to have a lot of feelings about science. Mm-hmm. We're going to laugh about it. We're going to cry about it. We're going to go on a real roller coaster of emotions. Are you guys ready for it? No, we're very excited to be here at Fermilab tonight, the place where some of the world's most important physics is done, because I don't know if you could tell from both the name of our organization and our logo, but we were founded by two physicists about 8 years ago this time of year, Ben Lilly and Brian Wecht. And Ben Lilly was actually spent a lot of time here at Fermilab during his postdoc years. And he'd actually left physics and moved to New York at some point, about 9 years ago. And he was kind of searching for what he wanted to do because he knew he wasn't cut out for research, but he wanted to have some kind of role where he could share science with other people. And so I actually met him in a storytelling class at a comedy club in New York. And we became friends right away. I was fascinated by him because you don't meet a lot of physicists at comedy clubs in New York. No offense. I'm sure all physicists are hilarious. But it was an unusual thing, and we kind of struck up this friendship. And he said, I want to start a storytelling show about science. And I thought, oh, no. That is a terrible idea. So I thought it sounded so boring because I'm not a scientist. I'm a civilian. Or a muggle, as I'm sometimes called. Unlike Kelly over here, who is a biochemist. Mm-hmm. But I have a journalism degree and experience on stage and comedy and storytelling. So to me, it just sounded like the worst idea. Because I appreciate that science exists. I love penicillin and electricity and things of that nature. But I didn't really see myself being interested in the process. But since I'm such a good friend, I went to Ben's first Story Collider show. I think you guys can tell I'm a very good friend. And I thought, he's got to have a friendly face in the audience, somebody there to support him for his terrible show. And I was so surprised because when I got there, not only was it packed, but the stories were really incredible. And what I realized that night is that science stories are really about the same things that all stories are about. They're about love and passion and ambition and heartbreak and all of those things together. And so I sort of went overnight from thinking this is a terrible idea to thinking, how can I get in on this? And so now here I am, artistic director of the Story Collider, talking to you fine people tonight, and that is the American dream. Thank you. Thank you very much. So that was 8 years, over 1,000 stories, over 200 shows in over 47 cities ago that brought us here tonight.
Yeah.
And we're so excited to be here at Fermilab. And I think, Kelly, you actually have kind of a personal connection as well.
Yeah, a little bit. My grandfather was an electrical engineer and kind of a master of magnets. He actually invented this semiconductor technology, and he named it FermiFET in honor of Enrico Fermi. And he and my father always instilled this reverence of physics in me, which I've always carried with me. And I hope he wouldn't be too bummed to hear that I became a biochemist and not a physicist.
I mean, it's not quite as good, but still good, right?
Right. It counts for something, right? Maybe? I don't know.
Do we have any life scientists in the audience tonight?
All right.
Oh, so there you go. You got some support.
Okay.
Do we have some physicists in the audience tonight?
All right.
Oh, physicists representing. All right. So should we bring out our first storyteller?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Awesome. Are you guys ready for the first story of the night? Our first storyteller is a senior scientist here at Fermilab. He's done some amazing things here. He's made contributions to the discovery of the Higgs boson, which I'm sure we're all familiar with here. He has produced a popular series of YouTube videos for Fermilab's channel. He was awarded the 2017 Gemont Prize. Am I saying that right? I don't know. You guys don't know. It's all the same. He won a very important prize from the American Institute of Physics in 2017. That's all you need to know. He has written 4 books, including The Large Hadron Collider, The Extraordinary Story of the Higgs Boson, and other things that will blow your mind. And I think we'll let him tell you more about that now. So please welcome Don Lincoln to the stage.
Well, welcome. Several years ago, in early December, I was on a ship in the middle of the North Atlantic. The ship was the Queen Mary II, and I was there under the invitation of the Scientific American magazine. They'd asked me to give a series of lectures on the cruise as part of their Cruise and Science program. Now, for those of you who have been on cruise ships, you know that things like the internet and email is a spotty proposition at best, and especially in December in the North Atlantic. But one day, the stars aligned and the satellite connected properly, and I was able to read my email. Now, initially, I did things like check what was going on at the lab, make sure the graduate students weren't getting into too much trouble, things like that. But there was one email that stood out. I received an email from a young woman of college age by the name of Penny Mashazik. Penny had a younger sister by the name of Terry, who was high school age, and Terry was apparently a fan of mine. She'd read books. And so Penny had decided what she would like to do was to give her sister an autographed copy of one of my books as a Christmas present. And this is a fairly common thing, so we agreed to do that. Now, when I came back to the lab, we arranged for her to send me a copy of the book, which I signed, and I included a little handwritten note encouraging Terry to continue with her interest in not only science, but physics and particle physics. So I packaged it all up, sent it off, and frankly, forgot about it. Well, a couple of days later, I received another email, this one from a woman by the name of Sandy Mashazik. And she told the story of her daughter, who had read some of my books and was a fan of mine, and she wanted to give her daughter a signed copy. Now, she didn't identify the name of her daughter, so I emailed back and I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. And by the way, is your daughter's name Terry by any chance? And also, do you have a second daughter by the name of Penny? Well, I can only imagine how she received this. I mean, was I doing some kind of cyber stalking? Or maybe it's, I work here at this large national lab. We have like the secret spy phone book thing that nobody else has access to. But no, I explained to her that her other daughter, the older daughter, Penny, had already asked for the book, and the book was already signed in the mail and would be under the tree for Christmas for Terry. So that was an interesting little event. But then it occurred to me, if two family members who had not spoken to one another decided that getting an autographed book was a good thing for this young woman, that maybe she really was a fan. So I took it upon myself to invite the entire family to come here to the lab, partially to meet me, but also to show them about the amazing science that this laboratory undertakes. So they accepted. it turns out that Penny was unable to come, but Sandy the mom and Terry, my fan, did come several months later. So I met them in the atrium of the Fermilab high-rise, and the first person I spoke to was Sandy, the mom, and she was a charming and gracious woman who introduced me to her daughter. The first thing that I noticed when I shook Terry's hand was she was shaking. Now, I don't mean like trembling, I mean like really shaking. So I wasn't sure what it was. I mean, was I scary? I mean, I first looked to see if I had fangs or horns or anything like that, but that didn't seem to be the case. She was just a combination of nervous and excited for being here. So we spoke for a while, and then what I had done was I had arranged for her to take a series of tours here at the lab. What I did, I thought ahead a little bit before I invited her, and I had asked a number of our young female physicists to be the tour guides. These were our amazing students and postdocs, but they were more her age. These were like 25 or 30-year-old rather than me. I mean, I would be much more like getting a tour from her dad, but I thought that she might connect better with these young women. So she got the tour of the 15th floor of the high-rise, which is where our museum and observation areas are, as well as the standard tour of the accelerators that everyone gets. But I also arranged for her to go into our neutrino lab, which is a quarter mile from here, 300 feet underground. She got in a rickety freight elevator, went underground, and got to see the world's most sophisticated neutrino laboratory. She also was able to go into the control room of the accelerator running the entire facility, and she even got to sit down and press a few buttons and control the accelerator. It must have been really pretty cool. I'm sure I would have loved it when I was her age. So after the tour was done, we met again to say goodbye, and I asked her, what was the most interesting to you? And she said, well, you know, I wanted to meet you because I like your books, but I really thought the laboratory would be interesting, but I thought it would be something I couldn't understand, but I would just maybe get a feel for it. But what I found was that in talking to the people who gave me the tour, I realized they're just like me. I could see myself doing this. This is something that I'm fascinated by, I'm passionate about, and this might be the career that I wish to take. So I was very happy about that because that was kind of the goal, was to give her a sense of what it really is like to be here. Now, before we departed, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. She was wearing a golf shirt, much like the one I'm wearing now, with a little V-neck, and I saw just a little, well, actually a very large scar reaching up from underneath the cloth. You could only see a little bit of it. I didn't know what it was, and it wasn't any of my business, so I said nothing about it. So we took our leave, and they left. About a week later, I received a thank you card from Sandy, the mom, saying that this tour was one of the highlights of Terry's life, which I took to be somewhat superlative, but I assumed that she really did enjoy it. But it was there that she told me Terry's entire story. You see, Terry was, I think, a freshman in high school, and she was something of an athlete, a track star, to be specific. But she also had a congenital heart defect that nobody knew anything about. And one day during practice or a track meet, I have forgotten which, she was running along and fell down unconscious. Well, a frenzied phone call, a panicked mom, a crazy ride to the a crazy ambulance ride to the hospital later, it was determined that she needed open heart surgery in order to save her life. They performed the surgery, and she's fine now, so it went very, very well. But it was during her convalescence when she read my books. Now, prior to reading my books, she was an avid reader, interested in many things, somewhat in science, didn't have a particular aptitude or interest in physics, and especially not particle physics. But over the course of reading my book, she really became engaged by the same things that I find so interesting. The fact that we are able at places like this to study timeless questions, questions that have puzzled mankind for thousands of years. And in reading that, she decided, this is what I want to do. So I was very gratified that I was able to give this young woman a direction, a path of something that she had not known before, because she didn't come from a household where science was common. Her mom was a pastry chef. My understanding is Dad was not in the picture anymore, and this just wasn't something she imagined until she had read my book. Now, this was especially gratifying to me, and it was for a specific reason. And to do that, you have to ask yourself where I came from. Now, I'm a senior researcher here at the world's best particle physics laboratory. Sorry, CERN. And if you imagine what my childhood might have been like, you could think of my dad was a scientist, maybe my mom was a scientist, and I spent my evenings in the basement with sparking electronics and explosions and chemicals and smells. The only problem is none of that is remotely true. I grew up in a remote rural town in what you might call an academically impoverished family. My mother had me entirely too young. My father never finished high school. Our conversations over dinner had very little to do with things like science and quarks and atoms and things like that. It had far more to do with professional wrestling and NASCAR and things that were more appropriate to the family. So the way I got here is, as a young student, I was an avid reader. I'd read a book a day. Now, most of those were science fiction books, but occasionally these were books written by scientists who wrote books for the public. And these are names that you'll recognize, names like Carl Sagan, Isaac Asimov, and lesser-known George Gamow and James Burke. People who had done good science, but had taken the time to write books for the public. And they had ignited the interest and fire in me to do the kind of research that I do now. It was about 15 years ago where I realized that this is why I was here. And I realized I have a debt to those people who allowed me to come here. So that's when I decided to start writing books. Now, I could have written lots of different kinds of books. I could have written textbooks. I could have written books for people who are avidly interested in science, but I didn't do that. I was writing books for the general public to understand the kinds of science that places like Fermilab, CERN, and other big accelerator laboratories do. I had in my mind a little Don somewhere out there. I didn't know where. It could have been in Oregon or West Virginia or Alabama or Kentucky, but someone who had the ability and the passion to learn, but didn't even know that this existed. So I was extremely gratified when I was able to do this and to sort of ignite the passion in Terry. Now, there have been others in the intervening years, other young people that I've met who I have seen something in and brought and given tours. And so far, every one of them has decided to not only stay in science when they go to college, but to go into physics. And it's too young to know if they're going to go into particle physics, but they are, after all, very bright young lads and lasses. I'm sure they'll do the right thing. So this might be the end of the story, but as I was writing this, I got to thinking about what would be the real end of the story. And the real end of the story has not happened yet. While it's true that my writing has repaid some of the debt that I owe to the people who came before me, I will know that I have really been successful when someday, several years from now, I go to a bookstore, Barnes & Noble, or maybe on Amazon, and I see a book written, maybe by someone like, say, Terry Mashazik, written as Science for the Lay People. And if I do that, I know that the wheel of life has turned one more time, that a new generation is being inspired by people who have done science, and I will know that all will be right with the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. Wow. That's so inspiring. I was thinking about, as we talked about Don's story over the past few weeks, I've been thinking about my own role as an inspiration to the youth. It's a little bit less inspiring than Don's story. As I told you guys, I'm not a scientist, I'm a storyteller. But I have worked with young people, coaching them on storytelling. Are you guys familiar with the moth here? Yeah. Yeah, if you aren't, check it out. It's like the Story Collider, but about more than science. I know, why would you want to hear stories that aren't about science?
Right.
But some people are into that, I guess. But I used to work for the Moth as a teacher in their after-school program. So I would go to high schools and work with these groups of teenagers on how to tell their stories. And at the end, we would have this big show for their whole high school where they would get to share their stories. And so when my first day in this program, I was a little bit nervous. I liked kids. I was excited to work with kids and their storytelling. I have a lot of younger family members, who are kids. And I myself, I don't know if you know this about me, but I myself was once a child.
Ah, yes.
I took the traditional path from infant to child to adolescent to something resembling adult. So I was really excited, but I was also nervous because I don't really think of myself as an authority figure. I was worried that I might have to yell at someone or tell someone not to do something, and that felt really out of my element. And the first day, one of the kids asked me a question that really stopped me in my tracks. He asked me permission to go to the bathroom. I had never been asked that by another human being before. It really took me off guard. I was just like, please do. I don't want to hold you back from that. And then as we got closer to the show, one of the other kids asked me if he had permission to use profanity in his story. And because I'm me and not a responsible adult, I said, express yourself. Which was a huge mistake.
I mean, I think it's good advice, but...
I was thinking it would be very tasteful. What he essentially did was deliver an Andrew Dice Clay set for his entire high school. I could feel the teachers and administrators looking at me like, did you know about this? And I just politely excused myself afterwards. So a little bit less inspiring than Don's experience. But are you guys ready for storyteller number 2? Yeah?
All right.
Awesome. I should tell you guys, after our third storyteller, we're going to break for a short 10-minute intermission, so you guys will have a chance to hit the restroom and chat and all of that good stuff. But for now, are you ready to introduce storyteller number 2, Kelly?
Yes, I am. All right, so our next storyteller lived in England until 1969 when he completed his PhD in experimental particle physics. He then moved to Geneva, where he did at CERN, where he was a postdoc and later a staff member. And then he became a professor at Stockholm University. Since then, he joined Fermilab 26 years ago. And since then, he has been involved in the discovery of the top quark as well as the Higgs boson. These days, he is now retired, and he spends more time writing. He's doing some acting. But as he says, once a physicist, always a physicist. So everyone, please welcome Mike Albrow to the stage.
I was 13, lying flat on my back on the pavement outside our house in my dressing gown and slippers. It was a clear, dark night in August, and I'd crept downstairs at 1 o'clock in the morning to see shooting stars, the Perseid meteors. I saw about one every few minutes, and I wrote down in my little notebook that I still have the time, the direction, drew a little map on the sky of where they were. I knew them to be like grains of sand burning up in the atmosphere as they came in and making the atmosphere glow. So then after about half an hour or so, a bit more, I was getting cold and I'd seen 10 shooting stars and I decided I wanted to go back to bed. Now when I'd left the house, I left the front door a little bit open, but when I got back, I found it closed and shut. Should I ring the bell and wake my parents? It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Or should I try to break in? It was 1956, and I lived in one of the new towns that had been built after the war, mostly to house many Londoners and others who'd lost their houses in the war, being bombed out. And most of the houses looked the same. like mine, ours was one attached in a row of houses, and each one had, next to the front door, what we call a dustbin cupboard for trash collection. You call it trash, I call it rubbish. But there was this cupboard door, and you could open it up, and inside was a dustbin. Above that was a cover, and people inside could drop their rubbish into the dustbin, put the lid over it, and then the dustman could come and take it out of the front. So I opened the door, took the dustbin out, lifted the cover, which wasn't locked, and I got into the house, and I suddenly wondered how my parents had been able to change the furniture after I'd gone to bed. I'd broken into the house next door. So when I then got out of the front door, put the dustbin back, and was very relieved to find that when I got back to my house, the door was still open and I could get back to bed. The neighbors never knew I'd broken into their house in the middle of the night. But I was more careful in future sorties about leaving the door ajar or with a block. Another time, a woman neighbor was walking along the pavement late one evening, and she saw a body on the pavement. Was he drunk? A dead body? As she told my mum the next day, she turned around and came back only about half an hour later, relieved to find the body had gone back to bed. That was me. As a teenager, I was lucky enough to live a bicycle ride away from a very remarkable man called Patrick Moore, later Sir Patrick Moore. So he had been he's a tall man smoking a curved pipe, RAF type. In fact, he'd been a navigator on Bomber Command in the war, and now he's a school teacher and starting to write books. He wrote many books. He later became Sir Patrick Moore. I'm not sure if I said that, because in 1957, the year after I first went to his house, he started a TV program called The Sky at Night. It became very popular because it was entertaining. There was always something interesting in the sky, and he was a very charismatic personality. And that program is still running 60 years later. He hosted it for 55 years until he died, missing only one episode. That's the longest running TV host in the world, I think, world record for that. But I could go round to his house, and he could show me, let me look through his backyard telescope. If it was cloudy, I could sit in his room while he was typing away on his typewriter and look through magazines and so on. And he passed me for my Boy Scouts astronomer badge. And he was always very helpful and encouraging to young kids. And that's something I try to emulate. Hi, Xander. I don't know if you're there in the audience. So then 1957 was a remarkable year because that was the year of Sputnik 1. Some of you may remember that if you're as old as I am. And also there were two bright comets that appeared, and I could draw them. I drew them night by night on black paper with white ink. The first one, Aaron Rowland, I saw and drew a sort of anti-tail. There was the tail of the comet, which I knew would always point away from the sun because the radiation pressure from the sun blows it away. But there was a sort of beard or anti-tail pointing towards the sun. I drew that, and I wrote a note about it to the Journal of the Junior Astronomical Society in England, which they published. That was my first publication, a discovery of something new. And that was pretty exciting for me. I think that's the first time such an anti-tail had been seen. It's due to dust that comes off the comet, and you only can see it when the Earth passes through the orbit of the comet. So that was quite a special thing. I went to Birmingham University, did a physics degree, and after that, for my PhD, I had to decide whether I would go into astronomy or particle physics. I told myself I could always be an amateur astronomer, but I couldn't easily be an amateur particle physicist, so I became a particle physicist. And I had a really exciting time very often with that career, being part of the discovery of the top quark and the Higgs boson and so on. I went to CERN as a postdoc. I spent 18 years there, and I was living near enough to the Jura Mountains to be able to put my 4-inch telescope in my car and drive up above the lights and away from the lights and above the haze and take long exposure color photographs of the Milky Way. Then I became a professor eventually at Stockholm University, and I went up there. Stockholm's at the latitude of Anchorage, Alaska. And I saw the northern lights there, which is due to trillions of particles from the sun coming and making the atmosphere glow with beautiful changing colors in the night sky. Later, I saw it even better from Lapland at a physics conference up in the north, where it was really dark skies. And lying on the ground is the way to see the sky. Just lie on the ground and you can see it there. So that's what I did there. Then eventually I came across 26 years ago to Fermilab to take part in the search for the top quark and eventually finding that. Unfortunately here, the sky is not as dark and clear as it is because of the light pollution we have, the haze we have. And it's a shame. I think we should all join the International Dark Skies Association to try to reduce the light pollution so that city kids can see more stars and even maybe the Milky Way. That would be good. So if you do see a good clear night sky, you see stars and sometimes some planets, but most of what you see is actually dark. You may not even pay attention to it. But why is it dark? This was a puzzle back in the 16th century. It's called Albrow's paradox. Think of the sun. Now, if the sun happened to be twice as far away as it is, the amount of light we get would be down by 2 squared, which is a factor of 4. But the area the sun shows on the sky would be also down by a factor of 4. The surface brightness would be the same. It doesn't matter how far away the sun is. Now, if Albrows paradox, if the universe is infinite and unchanging, then in every direction in which you look, your line of sight should eventually hit the surface of a star. And the whole sky would be about as bright as the surface of the sun. And it isn't. And now we know it's not a paradox, it's because we know that the universe is not unchanging. It started with a Big Bang about 14 billion years ago, and it's expanding and expanding. So the distant stars are redder and fainter, and also they're younger because of the time it takes light to get to us. And that largely explains why the night sky is dark at night. It may not be infinite either, but that's another question. But it's more than that, because the universe is actually accelerating faster and faster. This is so-called dark energy that got a Nobel Prize a few years ago for the discoverers of it. And Fermilab is involved in a project called the Dark Energy Survey to study that. We don't know what it is. We don't know what causes it. But it's a challenge to us and to the future. And I hope if there's any young scientists out there, you might figure out exactly what dark energy is. Hi, Xander. And that would be something great. So eventually, not long after I came to Fermilab, I went down to Argentina, where with other physicists we were planning a project to measure ultra-high energy cosmic rays coming from outer space. We don't know where they come from. We still don't know quite where they come from or how they get such high energies. But this was now astronomy and particle physics coming together. How lucky for me. We wanted a dark site. We found a desert in Argentina, one of the darkest places to be. And because these cosmic rays, when they hit the atmosphere, they make showers of particles that become, trillions of particles spread over the ground. And the flashes of light they make, somewhat like the aurora borealis, make visible flashes. But unlike the meteors that I saw when I was 13 years old, they come down at the speed of light, and in a millisecond, they've come from the top of the atmosphere to the bottom, where they're spread over many square kilometers. So the project, if I had eyes as big as dinner plates, I could have seen those flashes, like my 13-year-old looking at the meteors. But you have to have big eyes for that. And we made big eyes to see these flashes of light in the sky with stereo and so on. But also to detect the showers on the ground, made 1,600 water tanks, like backyard swimming pools with photodetectors in them, spaced over 1.5 kilometers, covering 3,000 square kilometers. That's about 5 times the area of Chicago. And from the directions, the timing of these tanks and so on, we could figure out the directions of these cosmic rays to within about the area of the moon, about 0.5 degree. So this was now astronomy, in a sense, with a huge astronomy detector, but for cosmic rays, not for light. In the southern sky there, we had a dark site lying on the floor, away from my colleagues. I could see the center of our Milky Way galaxy, where it's brighter. You could see 2 other galaxies, the Magellanic Clouds, and the sky is just an amazing thing there. And I went away from my colleagues to lie flat on my back, the way I like to see the sky. and I couldn't see anything on Earth. It's outside my peripheral vision. I could just see stars, and I could imagine to be not lying on the Earth, but to be surrounded by stars all around, like being on a spacewalk, but with no space station in sight. A feeling of being all alone in the vast emptiness of it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. Oh, that's beautiful.
So beautiful.
I'm told that you relate a little bit.
Yes. So when I was a child, I kind of did the opposite of what Mike did. I used to go outside when it was raining. I would put on my California Raisins raincoat, and I would lay in my driveway, sometimes with an umbrella, sometimes not, and just lay in the driveway and let the rain wash over me. So it's kind of similar, kind of opposite. There were definitely no stars involved.
Well, can I ask why?
That's a great question. I don't know if I could really tell you. Just a strange kid.
Well, good thing you grew out of that.
That's questionable.
Kelly and I have had the great pleasure of getting to know Mike these past couple of days since we arrived here in the area. He gave us a tour of Fermilab today, which was super cool. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend tours by Mike. I hope that 400 people request tours from Mike after this. But we really enjoyed kind of learning some of the unexpected things about this place. When we checked into our hotel yesterday, the receptionist asked us where we were going, and we said, well, we're doing a little bit of work at Fermilab this weekend, which is a very cool thing to be able to say. And he's like, oh, Fermilab, that place is so cool. You got to check out the buffalo. They're sick. And I was like, is this guy on drugs?
Yeah,
like, he knows
I didn't know
they
what he
do
was talking
physics
about.
there, right? And so it wasn't until last night when we first drove on to the Fermilab campus and I saw the bison that I realized, okay, that's what he was talking about. But very excited about the 11 baby bison, am I right?
And I think Mike saw one of them being born, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and apparently there's a couple more to go still.
Yeah.
They were apparently brought here by Robert Wilson, the first director of the lab, to kind of represent the history of the Midwestern prairie around here, which is very cool.
Yeah.
So, we have one last story for you guys before intermission. Are you ready for it? I think they're ready.
All right.
So our next storyteller is an engineering physicist who works here at Fermilab with some of the experiments studying neutrinos. She worked as a particle accelerator operator here in Fermilab's main control room for 7 years. And she is a 2-time presenter at Fermilab's Physics Slam, which you guys may or may not find out the date of the next one. It depends on if you like the Fermilab Arts and Lecture Series on Facebook. I'm told that these events are amazing. Have you guys been to a Physics Slam before?
Oh, yeah. Awesome.
Awesome. So without any further ado, please welcome Cindy Jo to the stage.
All right, here we go. Thanks. When I was just out of college, I had a pet snail. This was when I was still living in Portland, Oregon. I had bought a box of strawberries from a fruit stand in a hurry, and I hadn't noticed until I got home that there was a little hitchhiker inside. So I decided to keep him. I named him Professor Snailworthy. What I didn't realize until I had one was how much personality snails have. He had favorite foods. He'd hide in his shell when his cage got too dirty, very fastidious. He loved to sit in his water dish. And eventually he outgrew the strawberry box, and a friend bought him a terrarium to live in, and he would crawl up to the lid and sort of stick there by suction, hanging upside down like a bat. Well, needless to say, I absolutely doted on the little guy. And whenever I'd go on trips, I would get him a snail sitter. We would go on outings to the park. Whenever we'd go by bus, and sometimes I'd get kind of strange looks, but not that many because it was Portland, hey? So we'd get off, the bus at the park, and I would open the lid of his cage and let him out onto the grass to sort of taste the grasses of freedom and feel the wind in his eye stalks. And at some point, I would scoop him back in, and we would go home. Well, Professor Snailworthy grew, and I think he thrived. He grew from a size that I hadn't noticed in a strawberry box to maybe 3 to 4 inches long from nose to tail with a shell the size of a key lime. And I came up, wow, right? And I came up with this whole imaginary backstory in which maybe he would just not stop growing. He would just keep growing and growing and growing until one day he would get so big that he would break out of the backyard and go exploring. And maybe people would think that he was a monster rampaging the city, and they would get scared until I showed up. And he would remember that I had loved and taken care of him. And he would let me take him home. So I even like sort of drew little draft sketches for a comic. So just remember that you heard it here first. And Hollywood, I'll be waiting to hear from you about movie options. Well, during this time, I moved from Portland to the Chicago suburbs. And of course, Professor Snailworthy went with me. I'm kind of a rule follower, so I looked up the airline's policies on snail transport. I don't know why I couldn't find any. But I didn't just want to, stuff them in my suitcase and hope for the best. So I popped them in my water bottle and put plastic wrap over the top and poked little breathing holes. And I packed them in my backpack, and we both boarded the plane to our new life. I figured if anybody saw his silhouette on the X-ray and asked me any probing questions, I would say that I was a collector of seashells. But nobody asked me any questions. So I had moved out here to Fermilab to become a particle accelerator operator. And the thing was, so I was moving across the country on my own from my college town, which I loved, across the country, to a place where it snowed, and I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anything either. This job is so unique that they had to train me from the ground up on the job, and that meant that I was surrounded by the world's experts, and I was asking them what felt like incredibly stupid questions. And I was the whole time I'm sort of battling to tamp down that part of my ego that needs to prove that I'm really smart too, so that I can actually be open to all the new things that I need to learn, which is basically every single part of every single machine. And the thing about the accelerators is they also operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So everybody works a rotating shift schedule. Days, evenings, weekends, holidays, all of it. So it's actually pretty tough to, make outside friends. It's a pretty tough lifestyle, especially when, you're spending up to 60 hours a week at work. So at first, I thought I might bond with my fellow operators, but I didn't really fit in. And after a while, I started to feel invisible. I'd hear about what a good time everyone else was having at the activities that I hadn't actually been invited to. Or when I brought up wanting to participate in a project, I'd be told they were already done. Thanks. I'd bring up my ideas, but sometimes I'd feel completely overrun, like nobody was really listening to me at all, even in some situations where I was the one who was supposed to be in charge. I didn't really think they were doing it on purpose exactly, but I felt forgotten, and to be honest, that isn't really a better feeling. There could sometimes be periods of 4 or 5 days in a row in which I would maybe have no real life contact with other human beings. And that was a really tough time. Well, there were a few things that, Well, I'd graduated into, unfortunately, the worst part of the recession. So I didn't really feel like I could just leave because of a small thing, like feeling really unhappy. Lots of people were genuinely worse off. And besides, I was kind of worried that maybe it was my fault that people didn't like me because I wasn't likable. They didn't believe the things I said because I wasn't knowledgeable. And they didn't listen to me because I wasn't worth listening to. Well, there were a few things that kept me going in this period. One was my personal stubbornness, and another was my fundamental belief in the value of what I was doing. I was so in love with physics. I felt like I was in a unique position. I had access on the ground level I was on the ground level of big science. And, I had a level of access that few people on the planet had. And that some of the great discoveries of physics were due in small part to my training and experience and my knowledge. And that maybe humanity would know more about the vast universe around us because I was working hard and really devoted to my job. Late at night, when everything was running smoothly and there was sort of the humming and beeping and buzzing, I felt a sense of peace and of the rightness of things. Whenever I adjusted the machines all shift and I got a 3% increase in output, I felt proud. Whenever there were big discoveries announced and somebody got the Nobel Prize, and that was partly because of contributions from experiments here at Fermilab, which worked because of the work that I and my coworkers were doing, I felt like it was almost as if maybe 1/1,000,000th of that Nobel Prize was mine. This had been what I had been wanting to discover when I moved out here, if this was something that I could devote my life to. And the answer felt like yes. In retrospect, what I had been looking for was some type of validation. I wanted somebody else to notice me and tell me that I was good enough. And the stakes had been built up so high that it became all I thought about. And if there's anything that scientists are good at, it is taking in data and drawing their own conclusions from it. And based upon the input I was getting, I had concluded that I must not belong there. But in my loneliest periods, there was one living, moving creature around. And as far as Professor Snailworthy was concerned, the sun rose and set on me and my mango scraps. And at some point, maybe with his help, I realized that my core beliefs that every single person mattered and had fundamental inherent value should maybe also apply to myself. That my different perspective was important, that my experiences were real, and that my contributions were good. That I deserved no less gentle kindness and consideration than anyone else. And maybe I should treat myself like it. And that was a shift in mindset that helped pull me out of my funk. There's this concept in chemistry, the nucleation site. Conditions can be all ready for solid crystals to form out of a liquid solution, but maybe nothing will happen, lots of times nothing will happen until a seed crystal is introduced. And I've often thought that friendship works the same way, that lots of times it's not until you make one new friend that you meet all their friends, and now, hey, you've got 20 new friends. And that's what happened to me. Through that one friend, I started meeting other people outside of my bubble, and I started making a lot of new friends in my own right. I still worked a lot of weird hours, still worked a lot of weird times, but I started to feel like somebody who mattered again, somebody that people would miss if she was gone. Well, one day, after we'd been together for about 3 years, I noticed that the professor was being a little bit slow. I mean, he was a snail, but more than usual. But I was kind of busier now. I'd started to get known around the department for being good at what I did, so that opened up all kinds of opportunities. I'd started to, I was doing a lot of outreach, I was serving on committees, I was volunteering for everything I could. So I didn't spend as much time with him anymore. I'd change his water, I'd put in his food, but I didn't just sort of sit and watch him anymore. We didn't spend as much quality time together. Then one day, I noticed that he'd been inside of his shell for a while, and he'd never really done that for so long before. So I started to worry that maybe something was seriously wrong. I sprayed him with water. I put in his favorite foods. I actually picked him up and put him in his water dish, but he barely moved. And eventually, I had to accept that he was gone, and he was never going to come out again. I miss my professor. If there is such a thing, he was a good snail. His tenure may not have been long, but he taught me a lot of things about patience, about life, about being picky about your choices, but happy with the life that you make. He taught me to look at things from a different perspective, even if that means that you have to hang upside down for a while. He taught me to feel the grass under my feet and the wind in my eye stalks. And he taught me that sometimes that it's possible for you to grow and to change, even if everyone else thinks that you are too small. He was the thing. He helped me make friends. Having a weird pet is a surprisingly great conversation starter. And he was the thing that I packed most carefully to take from my old life to my new. And then after a while, he taught me how to let go. Someday, maybe, I will again be the girl with the weird pet. But I will never get over being grateful that I'd bought that particular box of strawberries. And I will never forget my first snail. Thank you.
Awesome. Man, what a beautiful story. Oh, I love that story so much. So now we're going to take a brief intermission. We're going to give you about 10 minutes to stretch your legs, use the restroom, whatever you got to do. But we'll meet you back here in 10 minutes. Sound good? Cool.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. So before we get started again, I want to tell you guys a little bit more about the Story Collider. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've now been to more than 47. I guess this is our 48th city that we've been to here tonight. And some of those are shows like this, where we can partner with organizations like the Fermilab Arts and Lecture Series. And some of those are part of our regular programming. So Story Collider now has a home in 9 different cities. Let's see if I can remember all of them. New York, Boston, D.C., Atlanta, St. Louis, Toronto, Vancouver, Los Angeles, and Wellington, New Zealand.
I think you nailed it.
I think that's all 9. We don't currently have a home in Chicago. If you're sitting in the audience and you're thinking, I wish Story Collider did have a home in Chicago, send us an email, stories@storycollider.org. If you're interested in making that happen, we would love to do more shows in Chicago. Thank you.
We'll look for those emails. So we also have a podcast. I don't know if any of you are aware of that. So you can get our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you find them. It's called The Story Collider. And every Friday we release 2 stories. So make sure to tune into it. And you can
find our full back catalog of stories at storycollider.org. I think we've almost 400 up there now. So if you've got a lot of things to pipette or type or, science things to do, we're here for you to entertain you during that. And also, I believe that tonight's show is the season finale of the Fermilab Arts and Lecture Series this year. It's going to start up again in August. And so I just want to tell you some of the things they have coming up because they're really incredible. They're going to have a presentation on what we know about the causes of autism on August 10th. They're going to have Bluegrass Concert, Run Boy Run, September 29th. There's going to be a performance of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein here on October 27th, which is very cool.
Oh, that's awesome.
And the Physics Slam, the date of which is mysterious. You can only find out on Facebook. I'm forbidden from revealing it to you. But I think it's very cool that Fermilab has this arts and lecture series to present some of the, artistic vision, intellectual vision from everyone here at Fermilab and to engage with the community in that way. It's really incredible. We're really excited to partner with them tonight. So with all of that said, are you guys ready for your next storyteller?
All right. All right, so our next teller is a visual artist whose work is inspired by science. So her artistic practice grows out of an intense curiosity about the ways our society is supported by science and technology. She's worked at Fermi National Accelerator's first artist in residence. The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District in Chicago, the Field Museum, and the Chicago Botanical Garden. She's currently working with the Army Corps of Engineers. So she's also worked in fashion design for many years and now teaches textiles at Columbia College Chicago. Her work is touring both in Europe and the United States, and she's been featured in Scientific American, the Chicago Tribune, Symmetry, and many others. So please welcome to the stage Lindsay Olson.
Think so? Okay. Thanks, Erin. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family that worshipped words and grades. My grandfather was a civil engineer who built bridges in Manhattan. My uncle was the co-inventor of the atomic clock, and his invention is in the Smithsonian Museum. My 90-year-old mother still does the New York Times crossword puzzles in ink. I hear some crossword puzzlers out there. So you'd think with all this intellectual egg-headedness that I would have been born with a love of academia, but I was the oddball. I struggled in school, and particularly with math and science. I have a vivid memory of being called to the blackboard in the front of the classroom in 5th grade to work a long division problem. Standing right next to me is the class math genius. It was a train wreck. It was awful, and I had no idea that math was really a performance art. It took me years to figure this out, but I belonged in art school, and eventually I enrolled in Columbia College Chicago. And when I graduated, I realized that making art about my own interior life was just not enough for me. I needed something bigger. I started painting area waterways. And in the process of creating these waterways, I would edit out the built environment. So I took out things like bridges and power lines, that sort of thing. And I was trying to create a more idealized waterway. Around this time, my husband and I bought a canoe. And as often as I could convince him to do so, he'd be paddling in the back and I would be painting in the bow. And one day we were traveling down the Calsag Channel, and we paddled right by this really unusual water feature. I later found out that it's called a SEPA station, and it was designed to be an engineered waterfall that added oxygen to the canal. And the structure really nagged at me because someone had gone to a lot of trouble and a lot of expense to build this, artificial waterfall, and it was in a very obscure location. And finding out who built that structure and why led me to the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. These are the people who treat billions of gallons of wastewater for Cook County. I met with, whenever I start these projects, I'm never sure what I'm going to walk into. And in this one, it was total blind. I had no idea what art I was going to make or what I was going to learn or what I had to do to even get permission. So I contacted the director and asked for a meeting with him. And he said this was probably the first and the last time that an artist had ever requested a meeting with him. And I was required to run a security gauntlet and present my idea to the 9-member elected commissioners. And that was really a harrowing experience I hope never to repeat again. But eventually I did receive permission to work in the plant. So I arrived at the Stickney plant, which is the world's largest wastewater treatment plant, and I felt like I had entered an industrial maw. It's really hard to describe the visual impact of this river of waste generated by millions of people. Eventually, I learned that the treatment process, the heart of the treatment process, rests on the microbes that live in our guts. And these microbes arrive at the plant in the sewage. Engineers and operators have figured out a way to condense the process that nature uses to clean water. So what takes days in nature takes really only hours in the plant. Showing up for work at the plant every day, I would bring my sketching tools and I would listen and look and ponder and be confused a lot of the time. But eventually I realized that if I used my training as an artist, I could learn enough science and engineering to tell the real story of water in a dense urban area. And I know this is going to sound really, really strange, but I fell in love with science in the middle of that wastewater treatment plant. Georgia Schwender is the gallery director here at Fermilab, and Georgia was interested in showing more art that was science-based and had heard about my work. And she attended one of my openings, and at the opening she said, why don't I come and visit her here at the lab and see what the gallery looks like? So we're chatting and talking about the artwork that's in the show, showing in the art gallery, and all of a sudden in the middle of the conversation she says, I have this idea. I'd really like to establish an artist residency here, and I'd like you to help me establish it. And then she went on to describe how Robert Wilson, founding director of Fermilab, was himself both an artist and a physicist. And it's because of his vision that we're having the arts and lecture series, that we have the art gallery and the beautiful architecture. But at the time she was telling me this, I was like hearing buzzing in my ear. I didn't hear anything she said except for, I'm starting an artist residency program. And this buzzing of happiness came inside me. Somebody wants me to do the work that I love. So we finished our conversation and we made plans to tie up a few details later. And I get in the car and I shut the door and I think to myself, oh my God, what have I done? What have I done? I've committed myself to learning particle physics. And this isn't just like terrestrial physics that's normal physics. High energy physics is really, really weird stuff. So the question in my mind was, could I learn enough high energy physics to make meaningful art? Well, of course, I had already committed myself, so I had to take the great plunge into the unknown. On my first day at the lab, Georgia had arranged for me to have a tour. And as I'm listening to the docent, and we're traveling through the buildings, and I'm getting an introduction to the kind of research that's done at the lab, I'm realizing that the whole lab is saturated in mathematics. And that humiliating feeling of not being able to do long division in the 5th grade on the blackboard came welling up inside me, because everywhere I looked in this place, there were blackboards. There were blackboards in people's offices, in the hallways, in the conference rooms. And if you go upstairs to the art gallery, there's even a blackboard outside the bathroom. So I was starting to feel pressure with this project. Not only did I want to do a good job for Fermilab, but I really had something to prove to myself. So there was nothing for it but to roll up my sleeves and get to work and do what I had to do. I learned about quarks and the strong force. I learned about the cosmic influence of gravity. I learned that all the visible matter in the universe, the planets, the stars, you, me, the Earth, all of that makes up less than 5% of the mass of the universe. I learned about neutrinos. Neutrinos are nearly massless neutral particles that are created in the universe in such abundance that trillions of them pass through our bodies every second. In order to learn more about neutrinos, I received permission to take radiation worker safety training. And I soon found myself following Cindy Jo and Dan Dwyer through the guts of the experiments at Fermilab. Now, the tunnels are crammed with equipment. They're kind of a little dark, a little creepy. There's probably a few spiders in the corners here and there. But I felt incredibly excited to have this privileged view of the experiments. Operators are charged with delivering the best beam possible for the experiments. One of the many, many tasks that they have to do is to balance the 1,000 superconducting magnets that line the accelerator ring. These superconducting magnets and the radio frequency cavities are what accelerate and control tiny bits of matter at near the speed of light. When I design these projects to work on, I try to create an immersive learning environment. So I'm interviewing scientists, I'm attending public lectures, I'm watching videos and reading books, and at the same time, I'm visiting art museums and research libraries, and I'm combing through art history, looking for images that will help me tell the story. And out of this scaffolding of information, I create art that helps the public connect with what scientists are learning. The show opened upstairs in Fermilab's art gallery in the fall of 2016. And it was a really emotional moment for me to look around and see all 27 pieces of the artwork that I'd created. I saw the sparkling threads of the neutrino pieces, the earthy tones of the standard model pieces, my modern-day illuminated manuscripts, and the wild ink drawings I'd created to express the magnetic forces at work in the ring. I'd created a physical record of what I learned at the lab and the relationships that I'd made with people here. I felt a sense of pride, relief, and emptiness that the making part of the project was over. And I realized also, though, that I felt really proud that I'm now, this big accomplishment, this big creating a body of work, this work was now ready to go out into the world and do its job, the job of helping others understand what scientists are discovering about life in the quantum realm. In my time at the lab here, I can distill what I learned into 2 nuggets of information. The first one is that scientists are paid to ask very good questions, design experiments, run those experiments that only lead to more questions. So really, the scientific method is just a brilliant blueprint for job security. The other thing I learned was that I'm not afraid to learn any kind of science, even high-energy physics. Science permeates our culture, and every time we open our computers, pass through a security checkpoint, or receive an MRI, our lives benefit from and are enriched by the work of scientific research. I'm really proud that my artwork helps to strengthen the connection between scientific research and the health and well-being of communities. And now I want everyone to know that you don't need a PhD to fall in love with physics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. As a creative person who also works with scientists, I relate very strongly to Lindsay's story. Back when I was in school, when I was in the 5th grade, we were told that we were going to have an inventors fair. Oh. So, yeah, not a science fair, but an inventors fair, and we all had to invent something for this. And I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to invent, but I had a strong feeling that my invention would be the best, based on a lot of positive feedback I was getting from my mom. So I felt very confident about this assignment all the way up until the day of the inventors fair, when I suddenly realized over breakfast that I had failed to invent anything.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I totally forgot about it. And so I thought, what can I invent right here, right now, in my kitchen, before the school bus comes? And the answer came to me. It was a sandwich. I could invent a sandwich.
Oh.
And so I invented the peanut butter and jelly surprise, which, in case you're interested, is exactly the same as normal peanut butter and jelly, except, surprise, there's a piece of ham in the middle. Exactly the kind of surprise that I think you want when you're eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
I know I do.
Yeah. So I only had time to make one, which is probably for the best, to be honest, that no one was able to sample this. I took it to school, and my limp, soggy sandwich sat among all of the other incredible inventions that honestly could probably sell on the Home Shopping Network today. Kids had like self-cleaning litter boxes and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd buy that.
And so I think that was the day that my parents realized that I was not going to work somewhere like Fermilab. But that's okay, because I get to visit and I get to talk with people like you're hearing tonight who are so incredible. So are you guys ready for your final story of the night?
All right.
Our last storyteller is a senior scientist who has been here at Fermilab for over 43 years. It's incredible. He's worked to communicate important decisions about physical science research to the U.S. Congress agencies in Washington and the world. He has been a resident research associate in nuclear physics at Argonne, a Sloan Travel Fellow at CERN, a university fellow at Yale, and now he's been here at Fermilab with us for 43 years. He has received the American Physical Society, Edward A. Boucher Award in 2010. His life story has been part of the History Makers Video Oral History Archives, and it's included in the Library of Congress. So please welcome Herman B. White, Jr. to the stage tonight.
Thank you. I've often wondered how you make decisions about doing new projects. That is, things that you don't know is going to work, things that may actually fail. And what arguments do you make to the decision makers who are not scientists about why they should support it? I have a little bit of experience in this. It turns out that being able to actually talk about the science and how the science is used is equally important. This is important to me because I grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, the Deep South. And this will become important as I go on with this talk. My parents grew up in rural Alabama on farms and settled in Tuskegee, a city, a fairly famous city in the middle of Alabama, where I grew up. My father served in World War II in the U.S. Army, and when he returned from Europe, where he served during the war, he had an international perspective, a world perspective that I hadn't seen in many people, but I benefited from it as a result. Tuskegee was an unusual place at that time as well, and so science and the Tuskegee Airmen, if you remember them, were individuals who actually were trained in Tuskegee. So I was surrounded by essentially science and technology and the ability to do new things, and had a really good time actually as a high school student with the college and with many people who were relatively famous in terms of what they did. Alabama at that time also was very important because of the testing of the Saturn V booster. And this was the rocket that actually took people to the moon. So you can see that it was probably not unheard of that I would probably wind up doing science for my career. Nuclear science was new in that time, and so I decided that nuclear physics, actually nuclear engineering, would be something that I should pursue. Let me point out also that Tuskegee was an interesting place also, not only for how science was done, but how it was actually used. We had science that was good enough and innovative enough to produce an atomic weapon that would stop a war. But we also had the legacy of the Tuskegee experiment, in which poor men in a segregated community were allowed to suffer untreated for a disease so that science could find out how that disease would actually ravage their bodies. This is my basis for being able to make the case for science. Now, I could say all the great things and the new things and the wonderful things that we actually get out of science and get out of our research, and that drove me into science. But my humanism is remembering what I actually learned from my hometown. I left Tuskegee and went off to a number of universities and Fermilab, as you heard, and various places around the country, and wound up at Fermilab, the highest energy accelerator in the world. And it was wonderful. I did a lot of nice experiments here. We made a lot of discoveries, made a lot of friends. And of course, it was extremely hard because you were doing things that you didn't know what the outcome might be. Many of us actually develop an ability to talk about science and to make science an important aspect of our lives and an important aspect of the world that we lived in. So every year, the agencies that supported our basic science, and let me just point out that applied science is usually supported not only by the people of the country, but also by industries and companies. But basic science is usually not supported by companies. At least they used to, but they don't do that now. I have the opportunity to join with some of my colleagues in going to Washington, D.C. to make the case for science. And every year we had a meeting of maybe 300 or so meetings in the Congress of the United States to get support for our science. And they made, I won't say it's a mistake, but they put me in charge of this at one point. They were lucky. And I decided to change things. Of course, when you get a new leader, you always find things get changed. So I decided that we needed to not only see all the people in Congress, but we needed to see the congressional leaders, that is, the individuals who were important for various committees that made decisions about science. And it turns out one notable visit that we had required us to go to the chairman of a committee, very important man, who was the congressman from the 1st District of Alabama. There's some value in that, by the way, the great state of Alabama. So I decided that we were going to not only go to Washington to see this man, but we were actually going to see him. Now, a district of the United States has about 700,000 people in it, and so to see a congressperson themselves is somewhat rare because the priority is given to constituents. And so eventually you just run out of time. But in my case, we decided that we should take all of the particle physicists in the 1st District of Alabama and bring them with us to our meeting. The people who were providing the resources for this trip were concerned. They actually wanted me not to do this because they didn't think we were going to have enough resources, and I convinced them that it was absolutely important that every one of the particle physicists in the 1st District of Alabama needed to come with us. And both of these persons actually agreed to do this. They were exceptional. It turned out that the congressperson also felt this was important enough to actually have a briefing in his office before we went in. This had never happened to me before. So we're waiting outside. There are 3 of us. And he's being briefed by the people of his advisors from his district and being briefed by the people who support him in the congressional committee that he chairs. This is an appropriations committee. Very serious business. They deal with money. So we are ushered into the room, and of course, it's crowded. There are a lot of faces looking at us now. My colleagues sit down. I do what's now known as my stand-up routine in Washington, and I start to talk about the great things that particle physics does for us, the great discoveries we've made, the possibilities of great things in the future. And the congressman was frowning. You heard that term, I'm dying up here? Well, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't doing very well. But eventually he stopped me and asked my colleagues where they were from and what they were doing there. And they said, of course, we are from the district, we're from the university, and we, along with our students, actually engage in the science that Herman is talking about at a laboratory, a national laboratory in Illinois. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. Then he turned to me again and looked and said, as he moved closer off of his seat, where are you from? And for a millisecond, okay, it was 2 milliseconds, I started to say I was from Naperville, Illinois, which is a nice place to live, by the way. But I thought very carefully and said, no, I should tell him, which I did, I'm from Macon County, Tuskegee. He said, Tuskegee? You're all from Alabama? I said, yeah. And then he turned and beamed a beautiful smile at me, which I really enjoyed, and said, well, why didn't you say so? What can I do for you? And with that declaration, we had succeeded. 2 things happened. One is that the congressman saw us and decided to support us. And 2, an appropriator asks you what they can do for you. That's very rare. That congressman and I probably would never have crossed paths many years before that. The volatile 60s, with all the civil rights and with social change and with wars, was not a time in the South where you actually had communication between various groups of people. But I saw progress. I saw the ability for us to actually be in the same room. His formative years in Alabama were very different than mine. But somehow, over 30 years or so, we found ourselves in the same room. And that meeting, which really was a meeting about science and about physics stopped being a meeting about reporting on physics and turned into a meeting, to use a euphemism, of folks from down home. And we actually stopped talking about physics for 15 minutes. The 15-minute meeting we were supposed to have turned into 40 minutes, and we got a nickname. We were called the Science Guys. That's really important because you're not doctor this or professor that. Everybody knows the Science Guys. And I was very, very happy to be able to actually have done something like that, to succeed, in fact, making the case for our science with people who not only would understand that the science was good, that it was an international and a national effort, but that people from his district, in the 1st District of Alabama, that's down by Mobile, by the way, were actually doing research in Illinois, and that it was a national effort and that it was important. We succeeded in getting that support. And I have to admit that when I talk to young people today and they ask me, how do you make the case? I invite them not to follow the path that I took, to pioneer their new paths, because things are different now than they were in the 60s and different now than they were in the 90s. But you cannot forget that past. The humanism with which I understood something about doing science and about being able to make the case for the work that we do that we're not sure is actually going to make any impact on the problems that we have now, but may very well make impact tremendously on the problems that we don't know we have now. The things that we do in particle physics may actually be understood and applied 50 years from now. And actually, I guess since I've been at Fermilab so long, it's almost approaching 50 years, so I should be careful about making that statement. But I am very pleased and very happy to be able to have developed those skills and very happy to be able to have had that experience. We're now at a point at which there are lots of discussions that are being made and people are saying a number of things that are basically not true. And it is time for us scientists, if there are scientists in the audience, to stand up, to speak the truth about what we actually know. These are our skills. We cannot let others determine what those skills are. This is what the congressman said to me. I certainly hope I stimulate some young people to replace me. Thank you very much.
Well, guys, that is our show. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Before we go, I hope you will join us in just a few quick thank yous. First of all, we want to thank everyone at the Fermilab Arts and Lecture Series, especially Janet. Thank you very much for bringing us out here, making this possible.
We'd like to thank Sean and Al for running lights and sound and doing really hard work for us tonight.
Everyone here at the Ramsey Auditorium and our photographer, Sean, getting shots of all of our storytellers tonight. Thanks so much, you guys. And then last but not least, we want to just have one more round of applause for our amazing storytellers tonight for sharing these stories with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.